All right, good morning. I'm Stephanie Barron. I'm curator at LACMA, and together with Courtney McNeil, we have organized this webinar with the terrific assistance of the home team at AAMC in New York. This webinar is part of the AAMC Foundation engagement program for International Curators, which is made possible by major support from the Terra Foundation for American Art. This is a live session involving current mentees, we are Stephanie Barron, Courtney McNeil, Alison de Lima Greene, and Anna Marley. And if you click on participants, you've got everybody's bios. And what we had thought to do is try to address two different questions that seem to emerge in the kind of current thinking. We represent different types of museums with different kinds of collections and sizes. We took questions ahead of time, which has helped to kind of form our discussion, and we thank you for that. We encourage you to submit questions during our conversation, and we'll reserve time at the end of our hour for that conversation. If something seems particularly urgent, we'll try to address it during the course of our two topics. So in thinking about those topics, where we thought we could kind of have some juicy conversation, we thought of international loans and fundraising. So as we kind of delved into that, we thought that there were a number of questions that really brought out very variant points of view. So we thought we'd start with international loans. There are several aspects to consider about the nature of requesting international loans. And we say kind of international in a way to kind of suggest perhaps trying to get loans from institutions that one is not always doing business with, or with institutions that with which one is less familiar. We tried to look at the topic from both sides, from being a borrower and being a lender. We recognize also that sometimes borrowers don't collect and therefore they never lend. And that's a whole other series of issues that brings up. So I thought in a way I would kind of kick the conversation off by saying that when one is thinking about requesting international loans, probably one of the very first things that we think is important is see the loan in person, visit the museum that you're going to be asking. You're going to have your director write to that director requesting the loan, because as we all know, those requests go director to director, and then they dribble down usually to the curator's desk and then find their way to the registrar's office, which manages usually the process of approval or disapproval of the loan. So the curator really is, you know, the linchpin in both requesting and approving or recommending whether a loan goes forward or not. And if you go to the institution to request that loan, you have an opportunity to not only convey the ethos of your exhibition and the reason for the loan, but perhaps see the work, look at the work together with the curator from whom you're going to be requesting the work, and really understand what the conditions are of the work. And that will kind of pave the way for the letter that might come many months later actually requesting the loan. So it doesn't come as a surprise to the institution. Speaking on the part of a large institution with a large collection, I would say that if a work of art is requested and it's a pretty well-known work or a work that gets a lot of requests, solo shows tend to get preference over thematic exhibitions, because the feeling is, well, there may be other works that could be substituted for the work that they're asking us for. And then I think the other question is, what happens when you decline a loan? You know, usually it's for conservation reasons or for a variety, or it's promised to another exhibition. You can go back and appeal. I would say there's nothing wrong with asking again, but you have to kind of come at it differently. You can't just say, oh, I got your no, and let's have it again. You have to try to make a tighter case for it, why it's absolutely essential. Perhaps if it's for conservation reasons, you can employ the advice of your own conservator. Maybe your conservator knows the conservator at the other institution, and they can have a conservation conversation. You can work with your registrar to try to find out what might be a better way of trying to organize the transport with couriers, or to minimize the wear and tear on the object. So don't just kind of sit in your office and kind of send out a request for a loan and expect that it's going to come back, you know, by return email. It just generally doesn't work that way. So the more, you know, legwork one does, I think you increase the likelihood of getting a yes back on your urgent and important loan request. Allison?
I would also stress strongly that really know the object well. If you can customize the letter and be very specific at the very beginning why this one object is the essential object for your show, rather than we are trying to put together every piece from the series, punto, it's not adequate. One of the things I thought I would raise, since one of the questions put before us in advance was, how much does the support of an artist help convince an institution or a colleague? And certainly when you're working with a living artist, that is very useful indeed. You don't want to use your artist as a weapon, however. You do not want, say, to alienate that artist's relationship with the institution that owns the work. Artists will often take loan refusals much more personally than we will. And so you want to take some care in involving the artist. The more experienced she is, or the more prolific he might be. There are, you know, varying factors. But it is, I think, very important when you're working with an artist, if you feel that artist's involvement is crucial to your show, and I always feel it is, that they look at the loan list, they talk it through with you, and then you also need to ask yourself always, do I really need this loan? There's a difference between many US institutions and European institutions. European institutions, when they do retrospectives, often do much larger shows than we do. And for example, we took a show from Paris, Life Career of Georges Braque, and we cut it down to a third. The Paris curator was devastated, but we really felt that we managed to tell the essential story convincingly and powerfully, while also keeping within a much more reasonable budget than originally planned. So I think those are the things that I wanted to touch on quickly at this point, but I'd also like to turn it on over to Anna about talking about shared interests and crafting proposals in collaboration.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Marley, and I'm a curator at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. If you don't know us, we are a smaller museum. We collect in the United States we have a few 17th century works up to contemporary. And I am mostly in charge of the historic works, so everything up to 1945. And we get a huge amount of loan requests. And recently, we've been getting more and more loan requests from abroad. And so what I thought I would talk about is one particularly successful loan request that didn't start out that way. I echo what my colleagues have said about visiting in person, and also definitely customizing your loan letter. I understand sometimes it can be cost prohibitive to visit everything. I always find when I can, that works out best. But you can always customize a loan letter. So definitely do that. So in this case, there's a wonderful exhibition that's opening this fall in Cologne. And it's the first encyclopedic show of art of the United States in Cologne. And so the curators wrote to me saying that they were coming to visit the United States, and they had a wish list of works. Works that they wanted to borrow happened to be 3 to 5 of our most popular and important works of American art. So I understood why they wanted them, but they also were either works that were promised to other exhibitions, local focus shows here in the US, or they were, you know, our largest insanely expensive $1 million painting that I don't think they probably could have even afforded the assurance on for the show. So when they came to visit, which was fantastic, I went through the collection with them, and for example, they had never heard of Cecilia Beau before. But when they came to visit us, they saw a number of her works. And I also told them about other works in storage. So I was able to help them and help them customize their loan list to get really wonderful works. We're still lending 5 paintings, 4 paintings and 1 sculpture. One of the original big works that they asked for. And they got a better knowledge of our collection. They got things that they might not have known about just from either reading textbooks or our website. And then based on our discussions about all of the women artists in our collection, many of which they asked to borrow, they asked me an essay for the catalog. So now I sort of developed a relationship with them. I helped them, and I also helped them try to find, if they couldn't, they've been having trouble getting a Twachtman painting, and we couldn't give them ours, but I suggested some private collectors they might reach out to. So I served as a curator on the ground in the US, just because I could see what they were trying to do. They're really ambitious. They want to do this great show, but a lot of the requests they made were for museums' best works. So they didn't get everything, but I'm happy to help them. And because they came here and they met with me and they were open, I think we were able to work together to do something great. And I think that from my work with Fernanda, who's not on the call right now, but was my partner in the program last year, she said that me coming to Brazil and working with her and asking her opinion as a Brazilian curator about which works I should borrow were much more successful than US curators just writing to Pinacoteca and saying, will you take our show or can you give us our loans? Not what should we borrow? You know, asking advice from experts, I think is really useful, and you might end up with things you didn't expect, but they might even be better.
Good points. Very good points. Courtney?
Great. Well, to give you a bit of context, I'm from the Telfair Museums in Savannah, Georgia. So a smaller institution, our annual budget is about $5.5 million. And we see about 200,000 visitors a year in a community of about 150,000 people. But that also has about the tourist board claims that we get 13.4 million tourists every year. Including both day trippers and overnight visitors. So we're serving quite a varied demographic there. And so even with a smaller museum's resources, we were able to successfully mount a major for us touring exhibition consisting about 1/3 of international loans that toured to 2 venues in the US and then finished at an international venue. And that was a successful project for us because I think we had a really good why for it. It was a show of American artists who were working in Holland from 1880 to 1914, which was really an underexplored area within art history. Nobody had mounted a major exhibition exploring the subject before. It also had a very close tie to our institutional history and to our own collection. So right away, creating our checklist, we were able to have a really nice foundation of important works drawn from our own holdings. The two most important things in making this project successful for us, I think, were getting support early on from the Terra Foundation, actually, for the planning stages of this exhibition, that allowed the primary curators for the show to travel and to meet up and to meet face-to-face. The curator that I was supporting at that time was able to travel to the Netherlands, visit partners there, view collections. So again, this idea of meeting face-to-face and even having conversations among collaborators in person really helped the project be successful. And then having that international partner, so a number of loans were drawn from the collection of the museum in the Netherlands that we sent the exhibition to, and they were also to be our person on the ground, as Anna was able to work as the curator on the ground for her colleagues in Germany, who was able to speak with private lenders. We worked with a couple of small municipal collections, folks who weren't really familiar with lending works from their collection at all, never mind to an international tour. And having those folks there to have those conversations on our behalf were really helpful. It also helped for us that we were, in order to get the top tier examples of works by these American artists working in Holland, we weren't requesting museums top tier pieces. These were, in almost every case, these were works that were very often in storage, that did not get out very often. So I think a lot of lenders were really happy to have somebody looking at the subject and to have these works put into this really interesting context and to get this to the light of day. So that's what made it successful for us. But really having that funding and that planning in the early stages was crucial to the project's success.
Good points. Couple of things kind of occurred to me. For institutions that have, so you're from time to time a borrower, but you're often, a couple of gems that are the things that people always seem to come to you for. So you're often also a lender. So something that can work, and you have to just, do it judiciously, is it's possible to ask for a lend back.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you have a major thing and the institution that is requesting it happens to have something that might make really an interesting kind of a dossier exhibition, where you could ask for an exchange and you could even build a little show around it, or you could do a blog post or some kind, maybe there's a scholar in your community who's a specialist in that area. You could build a public program around an exchange, something which you wouldn't normally might not be able to go ask for this major work, but you know what, if they're asking for something major from you, that has worked from time to time. You have to do it carefully, but it certainly has worked.
May I also add a footnote to that?
Yeah.
Particularly if you work with a larger institution, and it may not always be a bounce back to your own department.
Yeah,
it's a very good idea when you have your staff meetings to say, I'm going to go to X museum in Y city. Does anyone have relationships with that institution? Can you make an introduction? And do you have pending loans? And so that anything you can do to think about the larger institutional needs and not just your own departmental needs really helps strengthen your case.
We found that instead of just relying upon, talking at a staff meeting, we actually have that now run through our registrar's office.
Okay.
So in fact, when the loan request paperwork gets circulated, we know what other loans are pending to request to that institution, from that institution. And there are several cases where, I agreed to a loan of something that really hurt for a colleague who really needed a major thing from that institution. And sometimes it even works with other institutions. You mentioned, and I think you mentioned that when they came to you, you didn't have a Talkman that you could give them, but you could help find them one. Well,
Yeah.
I had a situation where I needed 4 major works from a smaller institution in Germany. They turned around and said, well, we're doing this show. We need, Pizarros. And well, I could only give them one, but the Getty had one, and I managed to call up the Getty and asked them if they would agree to loan to that institution as a kind of community payback. And they did. And I got my loan. So you have to be, you got to be a little crafty about how to get what you want, and think about it from, if you're a borrower, think about it from the lender's point of view. If you're a lender, think about it from the borrower's point of view. Don't just think about it with the transaction that you're doing at that particular time.
And so one of our colleagues also just suggested that, you know, use your big guns wisely.
Yeah.
And if you are involving an artist or you're involving your director to director, make sure it really is where it matters most.
Yeah, I think that's a, that's a very good point. And you can escalate. You know, you can probably go back maybe 3 times, but the other thing is, Alison, I was going to ask you about using artists. You know, when artists are upset about an institutional decline, I find that having artists write to a private collector, that usually will dislodge a no.
Yeah, and certainly artists and private collectors have frequently very different friendships and relationships of privilege that are quite different from institutional. You know, I did have one sad instance where a lender disliked our museum and tried very hard to turn the artist against us.
Wow.
Which sort of backfired all around. You know, you sort of have to, you know, as the curator making the loans, remember, stay neutral, or making the request, stay neutral, do not take sides. Even if you want to go home and scream, do not do it in an email or on the telephone.
Right, exactly. Good point. I think another thing is that, you know, what do we do when we are, you know, we're all on tight budgets making exhibitions, and a lender makes an unreasonable request in terms of courier, length of stay, class of service, you know, where it's going to break your budget, basically. You know, that kind of stuff really hurts. And I know there's an international group of museums that kind of try to get together to hash those things out about, you know, when do you request business class fare? When is it okay to go economy? You know, all of that. But sometimes you know, I've had situations where I've had 3 museums in one city in Germany, each requesting a courier business class, you know, and they were going to be on the same flight. And I just had to go around to them one at a time and say, come on, guys, we all have tight budgets. How about you guys bring it and you guys take them home? But can't you supervise somebody else's loan? You know, and if you leave that to your registrar to do, registrar to registrar, their job is to say no. Their job isn't to save the other institution money. But as colleagues, we can hopefully try to soften that. But it takes a lot of legwork, and it takes not just being what you'd say, you know, a typical art historical curator's job is, but being, thinking about all the various elements of what it means to borrow something and get it to your institution and why.
Stephanie, we definitely do that here at PAFA. We, particularly if we're sending loans to Europe, we will partner with the PMA, and
Great.
Because we have a smaller staff. So right now we have a huge amount of loans going out this fall, but we don't have couriers for all of them. So we're happy to let the PMA, we trust them, do that. So that might be a way for those of you borrowing loans from cities like LA or Philadelphia or New York to say, hey, could we bundle the couriers? The Met take this from Brooklyn as well as the Met, you know, or could PMA and PAFA go together? And we're happy to do that.
No, that's nice to hear, because also, you know, Alison said, you know, make sure every loan that you are requesting really is needed. You know, sometimes if you're building a slide lecture, you might, you know, put all these images in it, but when you finally come down to do the budget analysis of how much a loan costs, do you really need that loan from Australia? I mean, it's going to really, you know, do you need to spend $40,000 for one loan? You might, but then you're going to have to shave off, you know, other loans. So being mindful, I think, about the economic consequences of your loans. I mean, I see sometimes junior curators, you know, I have to have this, I have to have this. Well, look at the price tag and be realistic and say, you know, you only have X number of dollars for the budget for your show. Would you rather have the loan that costs $25,000 or, you know, 7 loans for $25,000? I mean, those are trade-offs. And I think, you know, we don't live in a world where there's, you know, tons of money for all these things. So we have to it's better for us to make those hard choices than for an exhibitions department or a registrar's department to just, I think, you know, say, you can't have this and you can't have that. You sometimes know you might need that expensive loan to make the point of your show.
The other thing we didn't touch on yet, which is insurance and indemnification. So the better informed you can be about your own institution's insurance status, indemnification budgets, then you will find this is something Americans experience more going abroad, but a lot of institutions, a lot of lenders are not comfortable with indemnification any longer. And so the more informed you can be to answer those questions when they come up, the stronger your position is.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of private lenders who just find it, you know, they don't want to go through the hassle of taking something off of their own policy. So it's just, you know, less fuss and muss for them to just say, no, we'll just keep our own insurance. But the cost, you know, it's a lot. Indemnity is a super important program that exists. And I find the amount of, I mean, I serve on both the domestic and the international. I've been on both panels, as I'm sure some of you have been. And, you know, it's an amazing program that makes possible, if the indemnity went away, I think we would see a real end to major international loan shows. So making sure your institution accepts indemnity and then being informed about what indemnity does and what it doesn't do so that you can speak in an informed way. Even when you're there negotiating the initial loan, you know, bring it up in that first conversation with the private lender. Better he hears it or she hears it from you than in some loan paperwork that they're going to have to get somebody to translate for them so they can understand what we've written them. You know, do it personally. Anything that's personal, I think, makes a big difference. Someone asked now just the difference between the meaning of indemnity versus insurance. So indemnity is a program sponsored by the US government, run through the National Endowment for the Arts, that will indemnify, basically means that the borrowing institution is responsible only for a small amount of the insurance, and the lender agrees there's a predetermined amount that's agreed to for the insurance value, and that value is covered by the US government. And to have a loan be indemnified, it has much stricter requirements in terms of inspection, in terms of couriers, in terms of guards, that can be expensive for the institution that's organizing the exhibition to provide. But in the scheme of things, it saves the institution money, but you have to kind of understand what it is. So, and it's a program that has been exceptionally successful since it's been around for 35 years. I think there've only been 3 claims in the full 35 years. It's a very important program. Let's see.
Should we move on to talk about fundraising now?
Sure, absolutely. I was just trying to see if there were any other questions. All right, so for fundraising, we divided this really into kind of 3 areas that curators are involved with fundraising. One is exhibitions, one is acquisitions, and then the other is as you're involved in general operating, perhaps a capital campaign, perhaps trying to fund chairs or, you know, aspects that you work together perhaps more with your development departments. So in larger institutions, there's usually a development department. They're the department that basically through whom all requests should be checked, double checked. The last thing you want to do as a curator is be asking somebody for money when they've got 2 other asks from somebody else in your institution. And it's like, oops, well, I didn't know that. So that's like, you know, check around because, I mean, we have a rule at our institution. You can't make an ask, of a trustee. And you can't make an ask without checking through the development department. And it's better for the institution so that you don't, you know, go at cross purposes. So the question, one of the questions that comes up, and it's probably more in terms of exhibition funding, has to do with potential conflicts of interest, kind of ethical considerations. You know, from whom do we raise money, for what, and what do we have to, you know, these are usually transactions. They're rarely these days is it just, you know, here's a check, have at it, and we love you, and thank you very much, invite us to the opening. It doesn't usually work that way. So the questions are, what are the requirements for the transaction? What are things that we have to do to make that funder happy? And is there a line below which or behind which one says, that's just too much? You know, it used to be that you didn't take money from galleries for exhibitions. Well, you know, that's changed. Or you didn't take money from auction houses. That's changed. You know, some institutions, you know, over the years historically have said, you know, we're not going to take money from corporations that do business with South Africa or that, you know, sell tobacco, or, you know, there have been changes over the years in terms of what kinds of money do institutions take. Then there's the company that wants to, you know, put its product, you know, on your plaza, in your lobby, you know, all of that. And what are those considerations? And that's usually not an individual curator's decision. It's a higher up decision, but a curator, I think, can weigh in on that. But they are usually bigger than a curator's individual decision. What about if you're requesting a loan for an exhibition from a collector, and the collector just say has 4 things by the same artist, and you only want one of them? And that collector might give money for an exhibition, perhaps. And do you feel an obligation to take the other 3? Or do you hold your line at the picture you really wanted or the sculpture you really wanted? Those are, you know, those are tricky conversations. From a gallery, you know, you're getting money from a gallery towards an exhibition. That gallery has, you know, you're putting works in the show. Are they for sale? Are they not for sale? The gallery obviously would rather have works in your exhibition that are potentially for sale. You know, do you let that color your, you know, your decision of how you build your checklist? You know, those are some slippery slopes. There's no absolute right way, but, you know, I think it's really important to recognize those questions and those gray areas. If you're not sure, talk about it with a colleague, talk about it with your director, talk about it with your head of exhibitions. Find a colleague who's done more exhibitions than you have. You know, it doesn't have to be in your area. These issues cross departments. What about provenance? Are you borrowing something where there might be some question about the provenance, and by your putting it in the exhibition, you know, you're suddenly kind of washing it? And are you getting money from that person? Those are all, they're all kind of interrelated, and it's just about being, I think, mindful of these of these issues. So there are, I mentioned the development department. Alison, maybe you want to talk a little bit about how we work, you know, in larger institutions, certainly with other departments.
Yes, and so often we have trustees or advisory trustees. There's a difference. Trustees have a greater responsibility to the institution, often with a set fiscal commitment every year. Advisory trustees are usually people we're grooming to take on leadership roles, or for other reasons do not have the deeper pockets. But there's almost no one who only works with one curator. And again, just as you want to make sure that you don't go up against your development colleagues, and you do want to sort of say, as far in advance as possible, I know you work with this person as well. I am going to go to development with this request. I am going to, ask this person to help underwrite an exhibition or underwrite an acquisition. I think, again, as much transparency as possible. Sometimes, it does feel a little like I'm letting go of control of my projects, but I have found after working for decades in the profession, that is the best way to go. Trying to race ahead of your colleagues and get your bid in first is not going to make for a happy career within a single institution, at least. So, and the larger the institution, the more mindful you have to be. The smaller, more nimble institutions, that kind of transparency is much more easily achieved. There's also, I think, ways that you thank people, and that you have to be clever about this. And you also have to make sure that you have an absolutely united front. And so recently we had an exhibition, and there were only 2 donors to the exhibition, or 2 underwriters. One was not invited to the artist dinner. And
Ouch.
and it was just a cascade of miscommunications internally. You cannot ever say, ever, it was someone else's fault. You just say, we messed up terribly. We are heartbroken at this error. The way I was able to fix it was a gift from the artist to the donor. And it wasn't a work that could be sold. It wasn't a piece that was of market value, but it was a very personal souvenir. And after a number of people apologized, the owner once again became very happy with us. But remember, every error, as well as every achievement, is a shared one.
Good point. Very good point. Courtney, do you want to talk maybe about the relationship in a smaller institution, of how it works kind of curatorially, development?
Sure, yeah. First, I want to say to Alison, I feel like that was just good general life advice, not just is to just own up to errors and not try to pass it off. But yeah, very, very well said. So at my smaller organization, there are 3 of us who are full-time curators and 3 other people who curate exhibitions sometimes and do other things as well. We have a head of development who has 4 people working under her. So even for a smaller organization, there's a good structure in place. When I first started there 12 years ago, there was just a single development officer for the entire organization. So we've recognized the need to grow in that area. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationships between sometimes between curators and development officers. It can be a little adversarial. There's a give and a take. Sometimes development feels like all they're doing is giving to us, finding funding for this, finding funding for that. And when curators act like it's a real bother and a real chore to give private donor tours, then, that can really sour that relationship quickly. By the same token, nobody can sit there and say that a curator should be spending, 30 hours a week giving private donor tours. So I think the important thing is having conversations with your colleagues in development and aligning your expectations, finding the balance that's right for you. Say it's like a standing once a month or every other Thursday in the morning, you're free to give these tours. So, feel free to set them up for those times, or for evening events, I'm happy to do 2 evening events a week, but it's really helpful for me personally to have at least a week's notice, since we all have life outside of work, and for me it's a childcare concern. So I think that voicing those concerns rather than me saying, no, I can't do this and I can't do this, and not giving them the reason why would be counterproductive. So I think as open as you can be with everybody about finding that right balance, I think is a really helpful strategy. It's helped for me. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of fundraising for acquisition specifically without cannibalizing other giving. So part of that is communication, as others have said, of making sure there are no outstanding asks to an individual donor, or perhaps thinking about the timing. If you do an annual appeal every year in November, making sure that you're not sending something out right on the heels of that, but you're you're allowing all of those pending asks to do what they need to do. Or if you have your annual gala, you're not making any big asks leading up to that, knowing that everybody will be tapped out for that. And we've actually had a lot of success in a couple of cases of doing a crowdfunding model for time-sensitive acquisitions. So we've had a couple paintings that were coming up at auction. These were not superstar works. They were works that both of them had a strong connection to Savannah history. So we were really the best home for these works. Yet they still had a hefty enough price tag available that we couldn't just stroke a check for them comfortably within our acquisitions endowment. So what we did was I sent out a group email to all of our director circle members. Now, I worked really closely with our director and the development director to make sure they were okay with this. And even until right before we sent it, I kept double checking, like, are you sure you don't mind if I send this email? Because there's always that pushback of, oh, so-and-so gave you $2,000 for this, and then they turned down our request for general operating. So I made that permission really explicit. And those were really successful experiments for us because the invested time was pretty minimal. It was an email with, everybody was BCC'd on it, but it was sent from an individual's email account, not through the marketing department's like e-blast newsletter format, because I think people can tell the difference there. And at a smaller institution like ours, this was maybe 250 people, and I know them all, and they know me. So there's a personal face behind that email, and they, in many cases, people gave money who hadn't given before to anything beyond their general annual contribution. And in other cases, even if they didn't give money, it was a wonderful conversation and talking point for us the next time I saw them to talk about this effort, and they felt more personally invested just having been asked to contribute this one time. And of course, we were successful in getting both of these paintings, and there was just a huge groundswell of excitement. It was a small thing, but something that people were really excited about. And we spend so much time kind of fundraising for operating, fundraising for debt, fundraising for so many different things, that it was nice to have people coming together and being excited about art for once.
I think that's beautiful. And I think, there's a particularly good life lesson, I think, to come out of that as well, is that people give to people. I mean, we all know that they're giving to the institution where we work, but they're giving to you. And they're giving to each of us because of a relationship that we've built with them that gives us that freedom, that comfort zone to even have that conversation. And the flip of that is manage those relationships. Don't forget them once you've gotten the big ask from them. And that is, if you want to talk about donor dissatisfaction with an institution, it's donor management. If you're never going to get anything more from that individual, they've already done something really important at the time. And make sure they know that. Make sure they're on your invitation list. Make sure you check in with them, a couple times a year. Have a lunch, go visit them. Make them feel that that initial donation, whether it's an artwork or money, still matters to the institution, that we haven't moved on to the next, flavor of the season. And I think that's a big complaint that I've heard over the years from donors. And I think it's more the curator's job to make it more personal. As Courtney just said, you knew those people, you've been checking in with them. So those asks, those are really important. And development doesn't they don't tend to have that same kind of personal relationship. So another good kind of life lesson, I think. Let's see, we have a question.
One of the things that does help a great deal is, do think about what is this person likely to support? And people often, particularly less experienced curators, rush in. This matters so much to me. You have to think about whether it's going to matter to the person you're approaching, whether it's a single individual or a larger organization. Corporations, for example, want to know about the public good. How does their branding, get increased? We're seeing less and less corporate sponsorship in general, so you need to sort of say, well, each thing, just as you tailor a loan request, you also tailor your approach to each donor, unless it's like that wonderful crowdsourcing project Courtney described. And the other thing is, be willing to hear no. Do not have your feelings hurt. Do not think I'm never going to speak to that responsible donor again, unless they say, I'm sorry, my philanthropy is now shifted to a new direction. They can shift their philanthropy in a new direction. Never take them off your Christmas card list.
Yeah.
Never take them off your list of friends. You don't want people thinking the only reason you established a position of trust was to get money from them. Hopefully, you still can go to them for advice or other forms of donations down the road.
What about when there's a conflict, perhaps, between when a curator wants to approach someone and a director has, kind of competing? How do you manage that area? And that happens, as we know.
I think the conversation has to start with the director.
Yeah.
If you have a conflict with the director, you have to sit down with her or him and say, I'd like to suggest a plan B. If they are adamant on that, that's the structure you're working under.
Yeah.
You cannot undercut it.
Yeah. What about kind of affinity groups? I mean, several of us have, kind of worked together with the development departments, whether it's for an acquisitions group targeted to a particular aspect of the collection, membership groups, ways that the institutions try to nurture collective interests. How about Anna? Do you have some experience with that?
Yes, yeah, I work a lot with our friends group, which is called the Peel Circle, after Charles Wilson Peel, who was one of the founders of our museum. And Peel Circle members are higher level memberships. They give $1,000 or more. So it's not like a huge, it's somewhere much lower than trustee, but higher than a general membership. And I'm enlisted to do a lot of events for them. We have an event coming up where we're going to a member's home, and there will be a tour of their home and their collection, and I will be on hand to talk about the collection and interface with the collector, because we have a long-term relationship. And then we have a group of maybe 10 to 20 people who will come. There'll be cocktails, and we do events like this throughout the year. We go to Miami with a group. We go to New York. We do private collections around here. We might go somewhere up in Maine or somewhere like the Hamptons in the summertime with this group. And mostly they want access to private collections and curatorial expertise. So we work really closely with development to help suggest ideas for those, and also be on hand to help interface. And that helps bring in new prospective members and brings people up from just general membership to a higher level, and maybe even one day the board.
Alison, you've got some experience with that too.
Yes, and we've went from having a single support group to having a great number for each department of our institution. And they have been calibrated with different price ranges, different opportunities. you can be a supporter of the museum library relatively inexpensively. You can join the elite director circle at a much, much higher price. We do find finally that with a number of groups that we do not need to schedule as much travel as we thought we needed. When you're in a large institution and you have 5 or 6 trips offered annually, well, particularly in this part of the world in Houston, Texas, a lot of our people like to travel on their own. They don't want to be handheld. And so think about, again, not duplicating efforts, or if you're taking a trip to a city, are there 2 departments that might collaborate in a trip? And don't think so much about, this is my donor coming on so-and-so's trip. Just again, that cooperation, which I keep stressing, is very, very important. And you can sort of be counterintuitive. We have a large installation by Mike and Doug Starn up, and we've had lots of membership events around it. But last night we had a Bring Your Grandchildren event, and so we had about 60 people coming with an age point spread between 5 years old to octogenarians. And it didn't really start out that way, it just ended up that way. It was a suggestion from one of our members, and I said, go for it. So the other thing is, listen to your affinity groups. When you set up an affinity group, set it up with some advisors who are part of the group outside the museum. They will tell you, we want to go to private collections. They all want to go to private collections more than anything else. But they will also help you learn about private collections you might not know. And they will be your powerful advocates. And so anytime you set up an affinity group, see if you can not be the only authority or voice on it, but find the up and coming people who can support you in planning programs, etc.
I would just add that when you have those affinity groups, it needs leadership from the group. In other words, it doesn't work if the leadership is, a curator and a development person. It's a forced situation, because that leader, maybe a board member, maybe an up and coming in the pipeline board member, has friends. And if that person does it, then they already have, maybe 3, 4, 5, a half a dozen people, and you got a cohort already, and they'll take more ownership and be more responsible rather than feeling they're just doing your bidding. I think that's super important. We too did something in terms of kind of a different kind of affinity, kind of membership, which is we started a program called Next Gen for, we're free to anybody 17 and under. And everybody who comes who's a child, who's 17 and under, can enroll in a Next Gen membership, and you're entitled to bring 2 adults. We have, over 60,000 Next Gen members, and you see them kind of coming around the museum with their lanyards, with their card. It costs us very little, but the idea is get kids and their families involved with the museum just as comfortable to come here. That is a really beginning of a pipeline to then becoming a paying member, to becoming a donor, but to becoming a regular part of the museum family. And that's been extraordinarily successful to us and costs us very little to oversee.
Great. Well, with that, I think we have covered all of the top items on our agenda for the webinar. We have just a couple of minutes remaining, and I'd love to put out a call for any last questions that any of our participants might have. Feel free to use the Q&A feature, as some of you have already been doing, to submit those questions. And while I wait for those to roll in, I did have a question of my own. for my fellow panelists. And I was wondering what all of you thought about the healthiest way when you have multiple curators of managing who gets to solicit a donor or who gets to put their project in front of a certain foundation for a request for support. You know, that could be decided unilaterally by a chief curator or a director, but I feel like there's a better way. And I was wondering what your experiences have been in that.
I'll just say in terms of like, just say applying for an NEA grant. I mean, they're not so many, they're not so valuable, you know, they're not worth so much money, but still you might have multiple departments. We work it through both our exhibitions department and our development department. So they're looking at the whole scape of how else might we raise money for that exhibition? What are other possible sources? Is this really the only one? And what, given our experience, might be what's the relationship of the amount of money we're asking for and the amount that's needed? You know, a $35,000 ask from the NEA for a show that costs, you know, $4 million is probably not, you know, a great, you know, equation. And what might be the likelihood of success given the subject of the exhibition? So, you know, we all want to see, you know, the yes responses. From donors, I think that is a delicate dance with the development department and the director. And there may be priorities, and that's why I think not being at cross purposes. In some institutions, you just go directly to the director, and others you go through the development department, and they've got the bigger menu of asks to philanthropists attached to your institution, and that often involves, you know, long-term strategy, particularly if you're about, I mean, good luck if you're in a capital campaign, because everything is going to go there, and it's going to get much harder to get your $25,000, $45,000 acquisition, even though it's a small amount of money for somebody who's worth, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars. They just don't want to bother them for the little ask. So sometimes those smaller asks suffer when the institution has big asks out there.
Great. Well, let's see.
I think there's one more question.
Yeah, I've got a question here asking, in Canada, large museums require 18 months to 12 months for loan requests. Small museums can be as short as 6 months. Are there similar standards in the US? And I feel like everybody has a different policy at our organization. We have kind of an informal policy, really. We should have a formal one of considering requests a year in advance. But I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts on this.
We ask for 6 months.
Yeah, we have a 6-month minimum, and we do recognize every now and then there's an emergency situation.
We we ask for 9 months locally, and we ask for 12 months anywhere outside of the greater Philadelphia area.
I mean, one thing I will say is that there are always exceptions. I mean, there'll be the small institution that's down the street that doesn't even know what they're doing 6 months in advance. And we all try to be really supportive of our particularly smaller colleague institutions. You know, that's important. But I'd say the other thing is it's important to bird dog those loan requests so that they go through your system. I mean, my biggest frustration is if we require 6 months and somebody else, you know, asks us for a loan and we don't get back to them for a long time, and then you get the call from your colleague saying, you know, it's stuck in your pipeline, you know, where is it, whose desk is it sitting on? You know, you've got to help manage that. When you approve it, you know, the registrars are super busy, they've got a big backlog. Your partner loan request isn't the only one they're dealing with, but kind of look after them. And I often tell colleagues, you know, copy me on your loan request. If you're having a problem, you know, copy me. And then I've often, you know, tried to get in there to get it off of somebody's desk who's away for 6 weeks and it's just sitting there. So trying to help manage the system of whatever it is in your institution is also super important.
We discovered a loan request came in very late simply because the US Post Office failed to deliver it.
Wow.
And it wasn't that it was, you know, it just, you know, so we did our best to help.
Yeah, we try to, so we'll send the paper copy to the director, and we'll try to send a CC paper copy to the curator as well. And then we also try to email it to the curator and to the registrar where we can to say, by the way, this is coming in the mail. Keep a lookout for it.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll say is, you know, the inundation of loan requests by email, I actually find really bothersome because you're not going to respond right away. You know, that's a place where I find snail mail. I mean, maybe I've been at this too long, but there's something about taking a pause, circulating it. You know, I tend not to respond so well to an actual formal request through email. I'd rather, you know, have a conversation with a colleague about it through email, but maybe that's just
What I find works for me is to get people usually approach us with, will you entertain a request?
Exactly.
Yes, we'll entertain it. Then the paper request goes into the mail. But because USPS isn't as reliable as it used to be, having a scan be emailed is perfectly acceptable.
But not as the only way it comes.
No. Still has to be paper. Our director will not consider a loan request when someone can't take the time to write a letter.
Yeah. I mean, we've gotten some from smaller institutions. Well, I was looking on your website and you've got this, and, you know, will you lend it? And the show opens in 5 weeks. It's like, no.
And also, I was at the Art Institute recently doing research for a show, and they said they won't consider. They need their loan request 18 months in advance.
Wow.
So especially if somebody's doing a renovation or moving, you know, the further out you can get those loan requests in, the better chance you're going to have it, especially considering the bigger a museum it is. Yeah,
because also museums have board meetings where these things are ratified usually only, or a loan committee only, you know, a couple of times a year. So if you happen to write off cycle, you're going to have to wait an extra, you know, 6 weeks basically to get kind of onto the next cycle. So yeah, the farther in advance, for whatever reason, competing requests, you know, is really important.
And I guess the other thing is, find out if someone else is doing a show on the same topic.
Yeah.
You know, there's only so many times that there can be a Vermeer show in our lifetime, given the limited number. So know that sometimes you either have to join forces or withdraw.
Yeah, good point.
Well, it doesn't look like there are any other questions coming in from our participants, and we are just at 3 minutes past the hour, so we've gone slightly over. But I wanted to thank my fellow panelists for a wonderful conversation, and of course to thank all of you who tuned in to listen and to participate with your inquiries. We really appreciate it. And of course, to the AAMC and especially to Monica, we thank you so much for your support in putting this program together and in setting up the webinar platform. It was really helpful. So I hope we've provided you all with some interesting food for thought and tools to put into use at your institutions in the future.
And a final thank you to the Terra Foundation.
Absolutely.
Yes, big thank you to the Terra and to all of you new members of this group. I can't wait to see you at the conference next spring.
Okay. Looking forward to it.
Okay. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.